I never imagined that I'd be so lucky to have basically a different job every year of my life and to see Formula One from a different perspective. And that's basically what's happened. Some of them have been not so good and difficult. Some of them have been amazing. In terms of commitment, in terms of focus, obviously being race and test team manager at Williams was like being in the army. You know, it was like being a platoon sergeant and up early every morning, last to leave the track, constantly thinking about damage limitation and trying to anticipate obviously things that would go wrong rather than how to make things go right. So that was it wasn't stressful, it was just very, very focused time of my life, which I really enjoyed in retrospect, partly because we were very successful and won a lot of races and won the championship. So, you know, I feel that was obviously I learned a lot in that time. And if I can learn something every day, hopefully I can put it to good use.
You're listening to the Mission Makers Show, a podcast that inspires humans to get into the mindset of success. My name's Farah Nanji, and I'm the founder of a business in the motorsports industry that explores leadership lessons from things like Formula One. I'm also a DJ and music producer in the underground electronic scene, and a public speaker on key topics like resilience, building high-performance teams, overcoming learning difficulties, and stimulating creativity. And to tie it all together, I love writing thought-provoking content as a journalist for these industries which are so unique in themselves. On this show, I'm sitting down with some of the most inspiring and driven people I've met around the world to talk about their processes, their failures, the lessons they've learned, and how they are truly making an impact for this world. Hi guys, and welcome back to episode 4 of the Mission Makers podcast. Today we're joined by one of Formula One's most prized journalists, Peter Windsor. Peter's had a fascinating career on the sport, not only as an award-winning journalist, but also as a team manager for Williams and the general manager for Ferrari in the 90s. He's worked with some of the most notable figures in the sport, from Frank Williams to Nigel Mansell, and in today's episode we discuss the evolution of the sport, the lessons he's learnt, and his predictions for the 2021 season. If you're as excited as I am about the return of Formula One, then this should be a very interesting episode to shed light on the inner workings of the sport. Just before we begin, if you're interested in some really cool rewards like DJ lessons, signed books, and live coaching with me and my teams, head over to www.patreon.com/Mission Makers to check out how you can access these exclusive rewards. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on Mission Makers. We're so excited to have you in the show. Our guests have so much to learn from you. You've had a fascinating career in motorsport. So I'd really like to just, take it all the way back to the beginning and go back to when you were a young boy in Australia, where it all began. How did you discover this passion for motorsport and decide that, you want to professionally enter this sport?
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I suppose I could mention a million things, but I don't want to because we don't have all that time. I think there were probably 3 elements in that. One was the invention of scale electric, which was just totally instrumental in the way I just understood motor racing for the first time. I understood there were these things called racing cars that went around racetracks and drivers could basically put them wherever they liked. And scale electric was just a brilliant thing. And I remember my godmum gave me a figure 8 scale electric set for my 10th birthday. And from then on, I was fascinated by motor racing. And then I was very lucky in Australia because in Sydney, where I grew up, we had a circuit called Warwick Farm, which was based actually on Aintree. It was run by a wonderful guy called Jeff Sykes, who used to work in England for the British Automobile Racing Club. And they sent him out to Australia to do a sort of copy of Aintree. It was a better circuit than Aintree, actually, but it was a copy in the sense that it was intermingled with a horse race track and it had to cross the horse race track. So that was all quite difficult and they had to lay down sort of blocks and paving every time there was a motor race. Anyway, Warwick Farm was just an amazing circuit, and we had the Tasman series and we had Formula One drivers coming out every year and we had beautiful motor racing in between. And that was really the catalyst for everything for me, because in school holidays from the age of about 13, I started to just go straight to the automobile club, the Australian Automobile Racing Club in Sydney, and just worked there with the 3 other people there, Mary, John and Jeff, posting letters, writing envelopes, cleaning cars, getting sandwiches from the shop, just being a part of the motor racing world. And simultaneously reading, obviously, as much as I could, because there was nothing on television at the time, and trying to improve as a writer and learn how to write. And then I think Jim Clarke had a big effect on me. He published a book in 1960, well, early 64, I guess, called Jim Clarke at the Wheel. And that was the first motor racing book I ever bought. And I remember reading it from cover to cover almost immediately. So it improved my English learning, if you like. But it was just a wonderful book about this amazing racing driver and the life he led. And that was just the end for me in terms of there was nothing else in the world I wanted to do but that. So it all started there. And I was very lucky to see Jim Clarke race several times in Australia. And I don't think many people, even in Europe, could get as close to the Formula One drivers as we could in Australia, and the sun was shining and they had their shirts off and it was on the grass at Warwick Farm and there were beers in the evenings. It was just the most amazing time.
Fantastic. So when you decided to move to the UK and pursue this on a deeper level, did you have a hard time kind of convincing your parents to let you move over across the side of this pond?
My dad was completely understanding. And my dad, I have to say, in support of what I was doing, actually befriended Jeff Sykes. And they had flying in common. They did a lot of flying of light aircraft together, and just very small single engine out at Bankstown, where Jim Clarke learned to fly, actually. And they became very good friends, Jeff and my dad. And my dad also then officiated at Warwick Farm race meetings as well, as a start line judge. And Warwick Farm in those days was cloth cap, tie, sports jacket. Was very Goodwood, and it was so my dad was just completely part of that. My mum was a lot stricter and wanted me to go to uni. I got a place to, I think it was New South Wales Uni, to study arts, whatever that was going to be. But then simultaneously, I did come to England when I was 18 or 19, just to see if I could get a job in motor racing. And I talked myself into a couple of the big press conferences that were taking place. It was the winter of '71. And just tried to ingratiate myself. I remember going to the motoring news offices and just knocking on the door and wanting to meet my heroes, Mike Doodson and Andrew Marriott. And they were incredibly nice. I remember having lunch with them actually that day. And David Phipps was another incredibly helpful guy. I met him at the Ford Motorsport press conference. I was only in England for 2 weeks, but I met him there, and I introduced myself as a young guy that wanted to work in motorsport, write in motorsport. I'd already done quite a lot with Australian magazines. And I got back to Australia, and then I got a letter from David Phipps just saying, if you really want a job in motorsport, I can offer you one. Ghost writing for me. I've got too many magazines I'm writing for. I need a bit of help. I can't pay you a fortune, but if you want to get the next flight to South Africa, I can meet you there. We can cover the Grand Prix together for Autosport, and then we'll go to England. And he paid me £100 a month, which was $1,200 a year, obviously. And I rented a bedsitter in Bromley for $17.50 a month. Wow. Bought a 250 motorbike from Chris Craft that I'd read about in Motor Racing magazine, and I was on my way.
Wow, that's amazing. How did you feel? I mean, did you feel like you were risking everything to make that move? Or was it just?
I was in tears when I had to say goodbye to my mum and dad, obviously. But it was for me, there was just no other choice. I'd met Jim Clarke briefly at the back end of the beginning of '68, after the back end of the Tasman series. He was flying out, and I had a coffee with Jim at the airport. It sounds incredible, but I did. And my dad was with me. It was just the three of us. And actually, no, there was a fourth member, a very attractive airline attendant that Jim was befriending. There were four of us having a coffee. And at one point I said to Jim, after I'd asked him why he wore a dark blue peak on his helmet in the '64 Dutch Grand Prix and the '66 Mexican Grand Prix, I asked him how I really wanted to work in motor racing and how would I do that, and did he think I could make it? It was a stupid question, really. I mean, how would he know? But he said to me, don't ever give up. You have the passion, don't ever give up. If you really want something badly enough, just keep your head down, focused, and work as hard as you can. And I've always kind of kept that mantra, and I've always thought of Jimmy. I've always thought of Jim. I think of Jim Clarke every day of my life, no question about that. And I think about that meeting and everything that he was as a race driver and everything he meant to me as a person as well, as a human being, and how he led his life. So that kept me going, and that's what enabled me to leave Australia to come to England, to that weird bedsitter in Bromley, and start, sink or swim in this big world of European motor racing. I loved it.
Fantastic. So do you instill that same mantra in your son? I know you've got a young boy.
Well, it's a good point. He's got this, I don't know if it's from me or whatever, but he does have this thing where when he discovers something, he just focuses on it 100%. Golf is a very good example. He just loves golf, and he's not really interested in any other sports but golf. And so, yeah, I do. I always think that it's better to do something absolutely flat out 100% to the best of your ability than it is to do lots of different things and have lots of different interests, which is kind of what my mum always wanted to encourage. But I was always 100% focused on what I want to do, and not to the exclusion of everything else, but almost to the exclusion, because if you're going to do it, you might as well do it the best you can possibly be. Funnily enough, another athlete that always made a big impression on me was Jimmy Connors, the tennis player. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember reading about Jimmy Connors that although there was no animosity that he felt to the other players, whenever we went to a tournament, he tried to make sure he stayed in a hotel away from all the other players or the key players that he was likely to meet, because he didn't want to have any interaction with them. He just wanted to focus completely on his own game and his own life. And I kind of get that. And I think I'm probably guilty of not being as social and as perhaps supportive to friends as I could have been over the years, because I similarly had that approach to journalism when I did start to find my feet, and I was going regularly to Grand Prix, writing for lots of different magazines. I kind of wanted to be in my own world, and if I saw the bulk of the British journalists over at the Elf Motorhome with Ian Young having lunch, I would go to talk to the Italians or the French. I would go somewhere else. And it was just, I don't know, I've always had that feeling of wanting to do my own thing, my own way, I guess. And sometimes it's led me down the wrong path, for sure. But it is something that has enabled me to keep my love of motor racing, for want of a better word, to keep it as pure and as honest as it can be, as I can be to it, if you like. And I don't really want to lose any of the things that captivated me when I was a kid. I want those still to be burning inside me. And I think that there's so much information out there now, and there are so many people expressing opinions on media platforms, that if you did go into that, or if I went into that, my brain's not big enough to be able to handle all that. I need to keep things very simple and basic. I need to think about what I love about motorsport, who I respect in motorsport, what drivers I think are doing a great job, and focus on that. And that's kind of what's kept me going all these years. I think there's another thing that's grown inside me over the last 20 years, perhaps, and that's hopefully because I've grown a little bit as a human being, and that is that basically, if you can do it, it is the following mantra. If you don't have something positive to say about somebody, or constructive, don't say anything. In other words, don't just go in for harmful criticism because you didn't think that was an appropriate thing to do, or you don't like that person. Don't say it. Don't go there. Only be positive and constructive. Constructive obviously does mean critical sometimes, but you've got to be able to show how things could be better, or perhaps how you would have done it in that situation. So that's kind of come into the way I try to do my job today.
That's very interesting because, you've obviously got a very successful YouTube channel that does critique the sport. So, and I think you manage quite a nice balance of, as you said, not being negative, which is great. And talking about what you mentioned there about, sort of keeping it very unfiltered, do you think the current drivers kind of do that as well? Do they stay in separate hotels? Do they completely try and stay away from as much of kind of, outside opinion and external forces? Is it possible?
Well, they have been, because they've been forced to in the last year, of course, because in their bubbles. And I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because probably if you were to talk to some of the drivers in a meaningful way, they would probably say they've actually grown quite a lot in not being allowed to sort of mix and do all the stuff that they would normally do, and to be able to be focused and staying in one room and eating with the same engineers every night has given them a different outlook on racing and driving and how to manage their careers. I suspect that is the case. Whether it's an improvement or not, of course, another matter. But I think in general, it's just all that noise out there. There's just so much stuff, isn't there? And it's just at one level. If you go to a Grand Prix as a journalist and you've got your media pass and you're in the media centre, and the first thing that comes up is that all the teams put up the times at which they're going to make their drivers available for interviews on the Thursday, Friday and Saturday. And everybody's out there with their cameras photographing all that, and they're all putting together timetables and when they're going to rush from one motorhome to the other. And I just think that's completely pointless, because it's not real stuff. It's a very time restricted, clickbaity little window of life. It's not really discovering what a driver is all about. And I stay away from all of that stuff, because I just don't think there's anything to be gained by it. And I don't think that all that rushing around is very good for one's understanding of what is actually going on. And that may sound like a sort of an old fuddy-duddy saying that, but I grew up alongside journalists, learning from journalists like Dennis Jenkinson, who's for sure one of the greatest motor racing journalists of all time, Bernard Caillet, lots of very, very good, as Jabi Kronbach, Gerard Flanco, Eric Batt, lots of very good journalists. And all of them built in times for reflection and pause and trying to understand what's going on. And we live in this vortex of activity now. And it's very difficult. It's difficult for people with brains like mine anyway.
So how would you change the current media approach to F1 in a live environment then, knowing that you need to still kind of, allow the audience into analysis and things like that?
Well, it's a very, very good question, because recently there have been quite a lot of surveys put out by the teams to the journalists saying, what do you think of our media service? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? How could we improve it? And you know what? My conclusion is that as I, probably many others, but certainly as I predicted several years ago, the future of Formula One is for each of the teams effectively to have its own TV channel and its own media empire. And the top teams, of course, do that really well now. And we're going to see that with Aston Martin as well, for sure. And, everything is so polarized now that Formula One fans, per se, I think, are quite few on the ground. I think there are lots of McLaren fans, lots of Mercedes fans, lots of Ferrari fans. And all those people go to those team websites and all their media platforms to get their information. And so it's a very good question to ask, I think, is what is the role, therefore, of the objective, supposedly objective media, which is not associated with any of those teams? Because it's very difficult now, actually, if you're not in a team, to have access to the drivers, to the engineers, to what's going on. And the teams, of course, let as little information out as they can, but as much as they possibly want to, just to get the audience. And it's as if the rest of the media then has to pick up the fragments of what's left and try to make the best of it and get some sort of picture. And if you look at the declining sales of all the big motoring magazines, obviously there's not a big market out there anymore for people wanting that objective view. You could argue that maybe that's picking up now with the YouTube channels and the websites of those, effectively, of those magazines, where the magazines used to be. But of course, that's free. So it's not a direct comparison. In the old days, not the old days, but not so long ago, somebody would pay whatever it was, £2.50 for Autosport and £1.50 for Motoring News every week. And that was it. That was how that's how you got your information.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't happen. Now you go, if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, you go to the Mercedes website, you go to the Mercedes YouTube channel, Mercedes, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, Instagram, and then you put your picture together and you got your information. So I suppose this is a very long-winded way of saying I don't really know is what the answer is. What would we want in a perfect world? I think putting aside the media, I think what the fans need much more and what they're not getting is lots and lots of great content between the Grand Prix. And that also includes maybe the evenings building up to the Grand Prix when the teams are debriefing or at the hotel. I think we should see a lot more of that, have a lot more access to that moment. And then, obviously, after the last Grand Prix of the season and before the new season starts, there should be much more of it around. But the teams just sort of basically go into hibernation. And that's where, I think Formula One misses a massive trick. I've said many times, in various columns, F1 Racing and on my site, that if I was running world motorsport, for want of a better word, I would ensure that all the top teams have their top drivers doing world tours between the two seasons, promoting Formula One in key countries. Countries where we're not getting great audiences, like China is a very good example. Everybody wants to make money out of China, but at the same time, nobody's watching Formula One in China. How do you solve the problem? You build up the sport. Obviously, you need to have an infrastructure to build up young Chinese drivers as well. But, if Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc went to Shanghai, we're not talking the COVID era, obviously, just normal circumstances, went to Shanghai for a 2-week blitz tour of Shanghai, doing lots of events, karting, big charity auctions, all sorts of stuff. It wouldn't hurt, would it? Wouldn't hurt, but they don't do that. So I think that's one area where we really need to pick it up, that stuff, that fallow period between the seasons. Speaking purely personally, I think being able to chat to drivers when they're relaxed and they haven't got 25 microphones in front of them is something we don't have anymore. And I used to be able to, whether it be Ayrton Senna, Jackie Stewart, Jim Clarke, obviously, but in more recent times, even Michael, you could chat to them when they weren't, performing in front of mics, and you could just say, "Oh, Michael, by the way, I heard you miss a gear on what happened then?" And he'd say, "Oh, yeah, okay, you saw that, did you?" And there'd be a bit of a chat. But you can't even do that now, and I think that is very sad, really. That doesn't exist. You can't really talk to the mechanics either. I used to know the names of every mechanic in the pit lane in every team, their background. We always used to club together if one of them was in problems. We don't know any of them anymore because teams think you're not supposed to go near them, and it's just pathetic, really.
Wow, that's really interesting. Going back to what you're saying there, I mean, if a driver had to make time for like a 2-week tour around a country to do these things, do you think that would maybe annoy a driver if all they wanted to do is race, or do you think they have to kind of accept as part of the territory? And then leading on to that, do you think then that having 22 races is too much to be able to then fit in, some of these kind of commitments?
Oh, I think it would really annoy the drivers to have to do it, but I don't think that's important at all. I think they need to realise that their careers are relatively short. The sport needs to maximise them as much as they need to maximise their careers, and it's for the good of Formula One. It should be written into the Concord Agreement that that's what they do. There shouldn't be any discussion about it. And so, drivers are employees of the company like any other employee of the company, and they should get on with it. Obviously, because none of them have done it, they'd all be very precious about it and wouldn't want to do it. But that's it. As I say, if I was running it, that's one of the things I would do. I think to your other point, sorry, what was the other point?
Do you think the current calendar is too long?
The number of races, 23. I don't think it is. No, I think, we used to do a lot of testing. We used to go to Kyalami, and I think Goodyear used to pay $100 a lap, a test lap or something ridiculous, or $50, and so did Dunlop. We did 3 weeks of testing at Kyalami, and then we went racing, and then we did more testing, and then we went racing. So in terms of the number of laps a driver does in the year in Formula One, it's probably working out about the same if you do 23 races. And I think, logistically and organisation-wise, it's a doable thing, and it will be doable. It'll happen. The only thing I would say is that I think we started to test the waters in 2020 with having same place back-to-back races, Austria, Silverstone, Bahrain. And I think they worked really well. Well, they weren't disasters anyway, let's put it that way. The second race was not a disaster. And because there'll be a lot of people who would say, oh no, every Grand Prix has to be unique, has to be in its own country. So I think that showed that argument doesn't stand up. And I think that, and I said, before the Australian Grand Prix was cancelled, but at the point where it looked as if it was going to be, I suggested in a video that the future for getting around the COVID situation is to do, I said 3 or 4 races at one venue actually, and then move on to another venue, because that would be so good from a COVID protocol point of view.
Yeah, of course.
And also from a point of view when obviously there are going to be problems with income earning, it would keep the cost down because it would reduce travel. And thirdly, there would be a massive reduction in the carbon footprint, which is not a bad thing at any stage, COVID or not. And so we put our foot in the water with that. But it's interesting to see that in 21, there are no same place back-to-back races at all on the calendar. And of course, the reason for that is because it's very expensive to put on that second race, because one thing's for sure, the race promoter's not going to pay for it because he's already put all his money into his first race. So it's going to have to be Liberty that underwrites it. And Liberty did that in 2020 just so that we could get a championship. But they're not going to do it again, and that's a problem. And so we're going into this era of cost capping, we're going into this era of trying to get to zero carbon, but we're actually expanding our global footprint massively and increasing our carbon footprint massively. So, that is something that it's a huge typical Formula One irony, if that's the right word. And I think one of the solutions is to start rethinking that and having more races in one place in order to cut down, if nothing else, just to cut down the carbon footprint.
Definitely, it's a catch-22, isn't it? Moving on, you've definitely worn a lot of hats in Formula One. Is there a role that stood out above from the others in terms of its level of commitment and difficulty?
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, I've had a lot of different hats. I'm wearing the Bucco hat right now, only because Jim Clarke used to wear Bucco helmets. I've never seen the Bucco logo anywhere, and thanks to Johnny Williams for this. I've been very, going back to that Jim Clarke discussion I had when the four of us sitting there, I never imagined that I'd be so lucky to have basically a different job every year of my life and to see Formula One from a different perspective. And that's basically what's happened. Some of them have been not so good and difficult. Some of them have been amazing. In terms of commitment, in terms of focus, obviously being race and test team manager at Williams was like being in the army. It was like being a platoon sergeant and up early every morning, last to leave the track, constantly thinking about damage limitation and trying to anticipate obviously things that would go wrong rather than how to make things go right. So that was it wasn't stressful, it was just very, very focused time of my life, which I really enjoyed in retrospect, partly because we were very successful and won a lot of races and won the championship. So I feel that was obviously I learned a lot in that time. And if I can learn something every day, hopefully I can put it to good use.
100%. And you obviously work very closely with Frank for a number of years. What's one of the key things that you learned from him about effective management and strong leadership?
Well, Frank was of the Jimmy Connors mode, total focus. So that enhanced everything that I was thinking anyway. So Frank was that on steroids, really. He was totally committed to running and to Formula One, and nothing else was of interest to him at all. To the point where, he used to get pretty scratchy if he had to spend Sunday afternoons having Sunday lunch with the family. I was just like, wow. I got to get out of here. I got to get back to the office and get on the phone and do something. So, that was Frank. I suppose that taught me that is a little bit over the top. I think with Frank also, one of the first things he said to me, and I started working for Frank initially on the sponsorship side, marketing side, he said, one thing I never want you to do, Peter, and which I've never done. I've never, ever poached a sponsor from another team, never even approached them, let alone tried to get them. And I don't want you to do the same either. And this was at a time when quite a lot of sponsors were walking out the door to Ron Dennis and McLaren. So, that I always respected Frank for that. And it was the same with personnel. He said, I don't poach personnel from other teams. And the third thing Frank said was never begin a sentence with the word but. And I never have ever since. Well, I don't think I have. Tried not to anyway.
That's so interesting. So talking about that, what do you think will be some of the keys to returning Williams to its former glory days?
Well, obviously, it's all about people. You can do a great job in Formula One on a very, very small shoestring budget, by which I mean the bare minimum that you need in order just to go racing and to have a certain number of people around the car and in the design office and the engineering and the machine shop. But it is about people. You can have all the money in the world, the wrong people, and you can fail completely, as BAR proved. And you can have a very small, tight shop, as Force India proved, and still do a great job in recent times. And I think Williams do have money. It appears they have money to spend, which is good. But I think they also seem to be employing good people, getting good people. I mean, Jos Capito seems to be a really good guy. And My feeling is that they will become closer and closer to the Mercedes factory team. I think the new owners see that the future of Williams is going to be closely allied to Mercedes. And obviously, if Toto Wolff thinks this is a guy that should be at Williams, maybe he was instrumental in the Jos Capito appointment, I don't know. But if Toto thinks this is a good thing for Williams to do, then I'm sure Williams will just jump to it and do it. And their key, obviously, is having George Russell. And when George is elevated to the factory team, then they would like to be the next Mercedes young driver team, I would guess. Then the next one, I don't know who it'll be. Maybe Frederick Vesti will be. That'll be his way into Formula One. So I think that's where Williams are going. And I think that's a pretty good thing. I always felt it was a shame that Frank didn't sell to BMW when BMW were offering him a lot of money to buy the team 100% when they were racing with BMW engines. And I felt that was the right time for Frank to have sold. But he was still he still felt, it's my team, I don't want to do it, I want to be the guy. And I remember he was quite derisory of Peter Sauber when Sauber sold out to BMW. And I remember him using the phrase, and Peter wanted to do something, and he said something like, well, Peter, you had no compunction about cashing in when it suited you. Don't come to us now for this or that. And I remember thinking, wow, that's, I hadn't heard Frank speak like that for quite a while. And that just summed up Frank's approach to wanting to keep his private ownership of the team. But now, of course, things have changed. Ill health has stepped in, and there've been several years of mismanagement of Williams anyway. So it was time to sell, and I think they seem to be doing a pretty good clinical job.
It's hard to know when to walk away sometimes, isn't it? You alluded to it, earlier about one of the main things at that time was really thinking about the dangers and the risks and the failure. And obviously, the sport is so unique in the fact that failure is absolutely critical, because if you're not pushing yourself to the limit and figuring out where that limit is, you won't succeed. So what's been one of your biggest learnings from failure in this environment?
A lesson from failure is what you read in all the books. Every time you fail, you're actually learning something. So it is a step forward, and you have to be very strong with that. And I think that applies not only to failure, but to all the bad things that can happen to us in life. You have to try to see, you don't see it as a positive, but you have to see it as a step in your own life and try to use it as a way of being a stronger, better human being. I think that's the first point. In terms of real practicalities, I've had 3 attempts to do Formula One teams of my own, and all 3 have failed. But I can look myself in the mirror and say that if I had drawn up a list of all the things that I could have predicted might go wrong with each of those 3 projects, the thing that actually happened, I would never, ever have dreamt of, because it was so way off left field that it was something that I don't think anybody could have predicted. And then I rationalized that by saying, and I guess that means that Formula One is just one huge ocean liner, and there's a captain of that ocean liner, and if he doesn't want you on the ship, you just get thrown overboard. And I think that's still the case today, really. Formula One is a private club, and I suppose it's that, the recognition of the private club, play by the rules, and often I don't play by the rules because for ethical reasons or for reasons of thinking that I can do it better, probably mistakenly. But I think it's that. I've come up against Bernie Ecclestone several times, and although he's given me a lot of work over the years, and I've worked for Formula One for a long time and hopefully will in the future, he's a very difficult guy in a number of ways, and I suppose I've failed in not being able to predict how he was going to react to various situations, when I thought smugly that I probably was able to predict him, but I wasn't. And I guess that's one area where I have to say I failed.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Hopefully the club is getting less private with the changing ownership, and maybe a bit more accessible.
Hey you, we hope you're enjoying today's episode. We're on a serious mission here to create one of the world's best podcast series, and we'd be so grateful if you could support us in any way by becoming a patron of the show. There's a tier to suit every level, from early bird tiers where you get downloads to all my music with some super cool ninja stickers, to our VIP Mission Maker tiers where you get epic rewards like exclusive footage that never gets aired, the chance to submit questions to our guests with signed copies of books from them, DJ lessons, one-to-one coaching, and a whole load of super cool Ninja and Mission Maker merchandise. You can start supporting us for less than what it costs you to fill up your car for a month by simply heading over to www.patreon.com/Mission Makers. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Talking about when you were a manager at Williams, and you had to manage legendary drivers, obviously, such as Carlos and Nigel Mansell, both of whom have been at the helms of some of the fiercest rivalry with other drivers in the sport. And in that situation, what strategies can a manager use to calm down the politics? Or is there an acceptance within the team that, there's no turning back, the relationships have really soured, and it's either going to be a very slow or fast burn for the team or for the driver?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think by the time Nigel was in Formula One and having conflict with his teammates, first Keke Rosberg and then Nelson Piquet, or Carlos was at Brabham, not really comfortable with Carlos Pache, and then at Williams with Alan Jones. By the time those situations had occurred, I'd had nothing to do with generating them, of course. And so I was close friends and kind of managing both of them. And my approach to it was always to try to get them to focus on their side of the garage, as Mark Webber would say, and not to let it get to them. But of course, they were both intelligent, very competitive people who, above all, wanted to beat their teammates. So it was never easy. It was always a difficult time. It was very difficult. I mean, if you talk to Nigel now about his relationship with Keke Rosberg, he'd probably say, oh, Keke was brilliant. We got on really well. He's a lovely guy. I learned a lot from him. I think he would say that. I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But I can tell you the reality was there was massive aggravation between those two. Not from Nigel's side, really, but I think Keke understandably got very rattled by how quick Nigel was and what Williams were not doing about that. And the same, obviously, with Nelson. In Nelson, it was slightly more cut and dried because he had signed as the number one driver. But not knowing Frank, other than the sort of Murray Walker-esque picture of Frank Williams, this wonderful, amazing team owner, he didn't go into the fine print of his contract and actually say to Frank, but what does number one mean? And he let Patrick Head put a few phrases in along the lines of, if there's one part from the factory which is a performance improvement, it will go to you, Nelson. The spare car will always be set up for you. If there's a Honda engine which has a few more horsepower than the other on the dyno, you will get that engine. So that was enough for Nelson to say, great, that's all I need. I'm going to be number one. But of course, what Nelson never did was say to Frank or to Patrick, but what happens if Nigel Mansell's ahead of me on the racetrack? Does he get told to let me pass? Because it never occurred to him that would happen. And of course, it never occurred to Frank either, really. And so when it did happen, that's when, it all went wrong. And that's when all the aggravation started. So, if I was running a team today, I would always go for the harmonious relationship with the best possible number one driver I could get. And then I would have a very comfortable driver in the other car. A bit like Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez now, or Max Verstappen, Alex Albon, you've got to say. If you've got Max Verstappen, you can basically put anybody in the car except Lewis or Charles Leclerc, I would suggest, and equally for those other two as well. Mercedes have got a great setup with Lewis and Valtteri Bottas. If they put George Russell in there, it would definitely unsettle Lewis, and you wouldn't therefore be getting the best from Lewis. And you could say, oh, well, that's Lewis's problem. He's got to get out and beat George. But from Mercedes' point of view, you want the best from Lewis. So there's no point in creating that, that friction. And Charles will be okay with Carlos Sainz, I think. Although I think Carlos is, obviously he's really quick over one lap, and he can he can detune that a little bit and then reproduce that over a race distance. But on top of that, Carlos is very good PR-wise, and he's got a lot of charisma, and he'll look great in red overalls, and you can see him being a Ferrari star that they all love. And I think that will possibly get to Charles, although Charles is a very strong person in his own right. So it may not. I don't think it will, but it might. That's something to think about.
Yeah, the season's going to be very interesting, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think another combo, sorry to rattle on, but another combo to think about is going to be Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris, because I think the conventional wisdom is that Daniel is the megastar and he's going there, and Lando will be a little bit behind him and it'll be a great team. But I can tell you now, I don't think Lando is going to get blown away. And I think when that starts to happen, when Lando is showing, maybe he's out qualifying Daniel a little bit, maybe he's ahead of him in the race, I think that's when there could be some. No, you don't get friction with Daniel Ricciardo because he's such a good guy, but that's when you won't perhaps then get the best from Daniel Ricciardo.
Talking about two more relationships, what do you think the Sebastian Vettel and Lance Stroll relationship is going to be like, and also Nikita and Schumacher?
I think Lance Stroll has got the best possible teammate in the other car, because he needs the confidence of knowing that he's capable of winning Grand Prix and maybe even a World Championship. He's got to have that himself, even if nobody else thinks that. It's no point in him racing unless he thinks that way. And he isn't slow. He actually is quite a quick racing driver now. He's developed a lot over the last 2 to 3 years. And every time he's within half a second, or he's actually quicker than Sebastian Vettel, 4 times world champion, that makes Lance look great, and that'll be amazing for his confidence. And I think that'll happen, because I don't think Sebastian is as quick as he used to be, and I think Lance is getting quicker. And I don't think there's anything to lose from Lance Stroll's point of view. It's the teammate made in heaven, because it's one thing to outqualify Sergio Perez, but to outqualify a 4 times world champion, that's a huge thing. And that's why they've done that, I think. And then from Sebastian's point of view, it's, he's just going there with the pure self-belief of 4 times world champion, Grand Prix winner, million times over, give me a good car and I can beat the world. That's how he's thinking. And he's thinking, I'll have a good car because I'll have Mercedes engines and I've got all the money from the Strolls and everything will be great. British team, they know what they're doing, no politics, all the things he'll be saying to himself. But none of those will actually be very helpful the day that the first time Lance Stroll actually out-qualifies him. And that will happen, in my prediction. Not a lot, but I think it will happen. I don't think Sebastian will out-qualify him every race. And then what was the other one?
Nikita and Schumacher.
I think Nikita Mazepin obviously is very rough around the edges, and we know he's had a lot of aggravation over the last couple of months over stupid stuff he's been doing on social media. I mean, just as I said, if I was running World Motorsport, I'd get the top 3 drivers to do a world tour in all the countries they don't want to go to. I would say to race drivers, if I was managing them, forget about social media, focus on your career, get a life. And I think one of Nikita's problems, I think I'm only guessing here, is that I know his girlfriend, or I don't know if he's still with her, but his girlfriend has a massive social media following. And so he's sort of growing up in that world of social media. And I guess he's just trying to think of how can I get more hits and likes or whatever it is. And get a life, Nikita, forget about it, turn off all the media and just be a racing driver. Because he is actually a pretty fast, aggressive racing driver he's got a lot of rough edges in terms of track craft, but he's very aggressive. And I think that's quite refreshing to see. And I hope that's what happens. I hope Haas or his management are disciplined enough to say, just, don't talk to anybody, get in the race car, work hard and do what you have to do. Mick Schumacher, got a lot of time for Mick Schumacher. I think he's definitely better than people think as a pure physical racing driver. I think he's really good. I think he's got some lovely round edges to his style, a little bit like his dad. I think he's just got the most amazing strength of character, and I can't speak more highly about how important that is. I think Charles Leclerc, same thing, everything he went through with his dad and other things in his life, in his personal life. And I think the way Mick is this shining beacon of the Schumacher name is just wonderful. And I think he'll go really well. I don't know how well I don't know how good a job Haas will do in getting a lot out of 2 rookies like this. I'd rather see Mick in the second Mercedes or maybe a Williams or a slightly more user-friendly team, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. This is the first time Haas have been in this position. They strike me as being a relatively cold sort of team where everything happens correctly. But ultimately get in the car and drive it. But I may be wrong there. I mean, it's so difficult to know really how the teams are without, being able to walk in the garage and chat to them for 3 hours, which we're not allowed to do.
Definitely. And there's obviously been a lot of crises that Formula One has faced, along the last few decades. Do you think COVID-19 was one of the worst? And do you think that the sport can survive if the crisis goes on for much longer? Obviously, they've handled it really, really well. They've set, they've really showed an example of how a sport can operate under the circumstances. But from a financial perspective?
Yeah, well, I suppose you could say we're lucky that the COVID crisis has occurred in the Liberty era, because there can't be many owners of huge sporting franchises with pockets as deep as Liberty Media, and they were digging deep into them to keep the championship alive in 2020. Obviously, they're hoping they don't have to do that again, but I suspect if they have to, they will in 21. So I think we all have to take our hats off to them for doing that and making that championship happen last year, and hopefully it'll be an easier time for all in 21 once the vaccine gets properly underway. I think that it's, Formula One has had many crises over the years, and over the years they've reacted incredibly well to everything that's gone on around it. And Formula One is about people, just as engineering is really about people. And I can honestly say that I cannot walk down a Formula One pit lane today, on the basis that I can talk to a few people, and not have a couple of conversations without walking away and saying, wow, that guy's brilliant. I wish I had his brain, or I learned a lot from that conversation. It's just full of amazingly sharp people. And I think if you look at the way Formula One reacted to the COVID crisis, almost without thought, really, it was just a reflex action of what do we do to make things happen. I think that was a case study for the rest of the world, actually, to follow. And I don't understand why, for example, the British government, I mentioned that because we're in the UK at the moment, I don't understand why the British government didn't say, or have the brains to say, let's just see how Formula One are handling this, and we'll kind of do the same thing. Oh, they're making masks compulsory for everybody from day one. We'll do the same. Oh, they're doing social distancing even on a starting grid when people aren't that close anyway, because there aren't that many people on the grid in 2020. We'll do the same. Why didn't they just copy all of Formula One things, Formula One's concepts from day one, and apply that to the running of the country? And we know now that if the UK Prime Minister had said masks will be mandatory from March the 1st, 2020, and social distancing mandatory March the 1st, 2020, I would think we'd be in a better shape now. And obviously you need a lot of research going into the vaccine. But then again, I'm amazed that Formula One was only used for production of masks and a few other things, and perhaps logistics and distribution. The industry got behind everything that was going on in the country really well. But I'm surprised that more Formula One brains weren't tapped into when it came to the formulation of vaccines. Because some of these guys are so bright that they could very quickly have applied their knowledge to what was going on at Oxford University. I think the world at large has missed a trick by not watching what Formula One has been doing and what great Formula One people have been doing during the COVID crisis. And just to give you one example of the way Formula One people think, when Ronnie Peterson sadly lost his life on the early Monday morning after the Italian Grand Prix in 1978, it was due to a fatty embolism developing in one of his veins, due to Ronnie having been over-anesthetized the night before. And he had so much anesthetic in his body, too much, that his body couldn't react to the embolism. Very sad. He effectively died of a broken leg. Well, Lotus didn't do the next race, which was Canada. The next race, sorry, they did the next race, which was Canada, right? Well, they missed one, I think. No, maybe they didn't. Okay. The next race they went to was the Canadian Grand Prix, when Jean-Pierre Jarier drove Ronnie's car, the Lotus 79. And I remember talking to Sid Watkins not long before he died about a meeting he had with Colin Chapman in the lobby of the hotel in Canada. The first time Chapman had seen Sid since Ronnie's passing. And Chapman, and as Sid tells the story, Chapman said, so what happened? What caused that? How could that have happened? You know, we all thought that he was going to be okay. Sid explained what had happened with the embolism in the blood vessel and all the rest of it. And that was it. Then they went their separate ways. Sid then said to me, the next day, Colin came up to him and said, look, I've done a sketch here of how I think this could be prevented in the future. You need to get this, 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 and this. This is what needs to be done to the blood vessel here. And he'd drawn a sketch. And Sid looked at it and thought, yeah, right, you know. But here's the punchline. 3 years later, The Lancet published a solution to the problem that had caused Ronnie's death. And it was identical to the one that Colin Chapman had given him 3 years before.
Wow.
What does that tell you? What does that tell you about the world at large not tapping enough, I think, into Formula One in times of crisis?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very interesting points to note. If you were Stefano coming into the sport now, with his newly appointed role as president and CEO, what would be some of the first things that you would do?
I'd say Peter Windsor must be given complete access to all the teams and drivers to ask whatever questions he wants, when he wants, and then we'll get on with the rest of business. No, I don't know. I would think one of the things that I think Bernie is guilty of, has been guilty of, was guilty of, is dumbing down the heritage of the sport, and he did that for one very good reason. We want everyone to focus on what the show is right now, and we want to get as many TV viewers following Formula One right now. We're not interested in having Dan Gurney come to a race or Sterling Moss or any of these people. Let's focus on the heroes now, the teams now. This is the Formula One as it is today. And that's kind of where we are today. And I notice it on my YouTube channel. You know, I can do a piece about Max Verstappen. Is he still capable of winning the World Championship because he's spending too many years not winning, or something like that, and I'll probably get quite a lot of views. But then the next day I'll discover a wonderful little bit of footage of Jack Brabham's drive in the '61 German Grand Prix when he had the Climax V8 engine for the first time, and I'll get permission to use it, and I'll put it out, and I'll do a little thing before, and I'll get 1,500 views. People don't care about the history of the sport in general, and that's really sad, I think, because we've got so much great heritage. So one of the things, if I was Stefano, that I would do, I would say, right, we're going to get Formula One as a complete entity, as it began, as it is today, and as it will be in the future. And we're going to maximize every element of it, not just now and not just tomorrow, but everything. We've got so much heritage, let's use it. So that's one thing I would do. Another would be, as I say, I would try to make sure that we free up access to the teams, get rid of this security thing that they all have, because if Formula One is going to retain its own DNA and be the only type of motorsport in the world in which you have to design and build your own car in order to enter the championship, if we're going to keep that, because it's good for Formula One to be able to say that every car is unique and it's the pinnacle of technology, if we're going to say that, then we got to make that technology more readily available to the fans, because at the moment they don't understand and all the cars look the same. So what's the point of having it? So that all has to be opened up. I think that's another thing I would do. Opened up in such a way that secrets are not being given away, but good people are in there getting information out that really means something. And then thirdly, I would plug those gaps between the end of one championship and the beginning of the next, and what goes on when they get out of their cars after qualifying. I want to see the debriefs, I want to see the drivers' briefings, I want to see all that on really good live reality TV, and I want cameras, I want GoPro cameras in the road cars when they're driving back to the hotels, and I want to make that a mega show and put it out every Wednesday on one of the big networks in every country of the world. That's how I would kind of look at it, I think.
And talking about YouTube and the changing digital landscape with journalism and reporting, obviously you've been, you've rode the whole wave, and you've really embraced the digital age as well. Do you enjoy this format of YouTube? Do you have any tips for people who are looking to grow their own YouTube channels? And do you think that it's given you a lot more freedom to cover, what you want to talk about, really?
Yeah, I think YouTube is an absolutely brilliant thing, and I say that because it effectively allows us to have our own TV channels. Whether you're a Formula One team or an individual like me, we can have our own TV channel, and we can basically use that how we want. And I think that makes YouTube very different from other social platforms. And I don't think YouTube should be included or bracketed with the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, because it's a completely different thing. It's a TV station in effect, which requires a certain amount of production and editing and proper content. So I think YouTube alone is a great thing. And it's really, to me, it's just a wonderful thing, because for many, many years, as I've kind of been saying already, I always felt that the BBC and the ITV in the UK, but when they had the Formula One rights, really missed an opportunity by not putting on a really good midweek chat show around Formula One, live, hopefully, in which you got the key Formula One people to come in and have a spirited discussion about something. And that never happened. Or indeed, you were filming them, wherever they were in the world at that point. But there was nothing made of Formula One between the races. And that, to me, is always as interesting as the races themselves. It's the people. And YouTube does kind of allow you to do that, kind of. And so I think it's a great thing. I mean, the interesting thing is how YouTube has evolved, because I remember almost as if it was yesterday, the day that Matt Bishop, a very good friend of mine, rang to say, I don't know when it was, probably 20 years ago, maybe more, saying, Peter, you got to have a look at this thing called YouTube. It's amazing because you can look at footage from Grand Prix, the 76 British Grand Prix or the 63 German Grand Prix, stuff that we'd never been able to see. It's on YouTube. All the stuff that was shown on TV is on YouTube. It's amazing. And so for many years, YouTube, in my mind, was always this amazing facility that allowed us to look at great footage that we'd never had access to before. The Beatles in 65, whatever it was, singing "She Loves You." We could never see that, but there it was on YouTube. And that's, for me, that was the main purpose of YouTube, and kind of still is. But the interesting thing is how it's evolved into this whole new genre of young would-be filmmakers, directors, producing this new slick type of video, which is almost in style, is almost unique now to YouTube. It's not a cinematic style, it's not a television style, it's a YouTube style. And it's developed this sort of creativity that becomes something that's quite intoxicating, actually. I don't enjoy all of it, and I don't personally feel comfortable with all the clickbait, short video, punchy lines, punchy titles that are there purely to generate numbers of hits and subscribers, because then you're going down the road of, we're not doing this for the right reason, we're doing it for some financial gain or something like that. But if you're doing YouTube because you really want to show that this young driver has enormous potential and this is why, or this event from the past was very significant because it influenced what happened then, or you're giving a commentary about what's happened in Formula One that day, hopefully objectively, to bring to life some of the events that might have just been, passing otherwise unsaid, then I think YouTube is a really good thing. That's how I approach it, to be honest. I don't have a brain that's capable of giving me to looking at a subject and looking at it anything other than a relatively straight, pure way. And I would never say, and I know some people put on a really difficult or catchy title to a YouTube video just to get people to click on it, even though the video has nothing to do with the title. Hopefully, I don't think that's a good thing, and maybe that needs to be looked at by YouTube.
Yeah, definitely. When visiting your website, we're greeted with the following quote on your homepage, that chance doesn't exist and there's always a cause and reason for everything. So talk to me about, the origins of that quote and how it's gone on to inform your own sort of personal philosophies.
Yeah, it was interesting when Trump walked out of the White House. He said, and I wish the new administration a lot of luck. Almost, he didn't say because they're going to need it. He just said a lot of luck. Yes. I remember thinking, I wonder if he really understands what luck is, because luck it's a word we use and we've created as human beings, basically to describe events that are either good or bad. It can be bad luck, without really. And what it does, it basically shorthand for not thinking through why something has happened. And for everything, there is a reason. I know that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but I believe in causality. Obviously, I believe in causality. And I think that if we don't believe that there is a cause and a reason for everything, it's very difficult on a daily basis to grow as human beings. And if we just said, oh, well, it's just luck, it's a bit like saying, oh, it's just fate. What does that mean? Where does that mean in terms of our sense of direction, as on the basis that we are on this planet Earth to grow as human beings, hopefully to grow in the right direction and become better people? How does writing something off as luck help in any way? It doesn't. And so, whether it's a genetic thing that you can trace back, or whether it's one event that led to another event, or one poor decision here led to a poor decision there, which was corrected here but not corrected there, that's a beneficial thing. To know why things happened can only be beneficial. And that's what Formula One has taught me. Whatever happens, let's learn from it. And we learn from it by trying to understand why it happened. Accidents, engine failures, car failures, whatever it is, you've got to understand what's going on. And I think that maxim on my website is basically saying everything in life we can learn from, and there is a cause and a reason for everything if you look deeply enough. And it's difficult these days to talk about the God inside us, or a God that we may or may not believe in. But I think if each of us looks in the mirror and looks deep inside us, we'll all find our own, for want of a better word, God.
100%. Yeah, I really do believe in energy and those things. And last couple of questions from me. If you could impart any advice for the future generations looking to get into a similar career path, what kinds of advice would you give?
Well, I had a lovely chap contacted me not so long ago. He's a physio, actually, based in the wilds of Canada, Saskatchewan, who really wants to be a Formula One physio. And he said, Peter, how the system works, how can I do that? And all I could say to him was, look, you've got to take every day as it comes. Easy to say that, but that is the reality of life. And start at the motor racing level at which is out there. Something that's achievable and doable from your point of view, whether it's a local club race, whatever it is, get in there and start showing your wares. And things will grow from there in ways that you can't predict. And I think that applies to everything, doesn't it? When we have an insurmountable problem, the only way really to tackle it is to take it little piece by little piece, and then seeing how the picture then begins to grow and how we can then perhaps do more. And I think that's the same for journalism. I think, if you're a young would-be journalist, it's important, obviously, to work as hard as you can on the language in which you're writing. Let's assume it's English. Very important to have a full and proper grasp of grammar, not to split independent clauses with commas, as you often see in headlines in the Daily Telegraph these days, or on huge billboards. It's just appalling, I think, the grammar of some of the British newspapers now. I've got to say here, the American newspapers in general have a much higher standard of grammar than the British, interestingly. So having a very good grasp of grammar. And here I'd put in a big plug for a book called The Elements of Style by Strunk and White, which is still, for me, the bedrock of the English language. Thanks to Mel Nichols of Car Magazine and later Haymarket for that reference. And that was a great book for me to read. I think it's very important, obviously, I would say to learn to touch type, but obviously kids these days grow up on keyboards anyway, so that's no longer an issue. And then I think you've got to know your subject, and I don't think there's any point in wanting to be a motor racing journalist and perhaps trying to get a press pass and go to Brands Hatch and look at a round of the British Touring Car Championship, unless you also know how many World Championships Alberto Ascari won and who led the opening lap of the 64 Belgian Grand Prix. You've got to know your sport in order to make any sort of qualitative judgment of anything you're watching, regardless of the category of racing. And that's a really difficult thing today, because most younger journalists, I think, like most people in the world, have so much access to information that they just funnel it down to British touring cars, what's going on here, and it's all there in front of them. But then that has the undesirable effect of not allowing them to see the broad picture. And I think having a full understanding of motorsport is really, really important, because only then can you make proper judgments. And judgments, I say judgments, observations is perhaps a better word, meaningful observations. And then I think start small and grow from there. You know, whether it's writing about your local, I used to write about local events in Manly, where I grew up in Sydney, for the Manly Daily newspaper. I didn't charge them any money. I just wanted to get my name out there and do some writing. And then one thing led to another. Somebody saw that, offered me a job with another magazine, Australian Motoring News. Somebody saw that, Autosport got in touch, you know, and then it goes from there. But you've got to start small at a level that you can do. There's no point in doing something that is way beyond your scope, because it'll never happen.
I agree. I think, you know, it's a marathon, isn't it? Not a sprint. So final question is, you've had the opportunity to travel the world, you know, all over the world with your career. And outside of the racetrack, what have been some of your favourite hidden paths to explore, both internationally and also here in the UK? Where should people be going for some interesting trails? Well, Peter, thank you so much for coming on the show. We've really enjoyed having you on, and we're wishing you all the best for this year, and hope to see you very soon. And if you guys haven't checked out his YouTube channel, obviously we'll give it a huge plug in the show notes as well.
Thank you very much. It's very kind, and thank you for having me.
Well, Peter's journey is nothing short of extraordinary, and I love the mantra he holds close to his heart by Ilahi of chance not existing. There is always a cause and reason for everything. It's going to be really interesting to see how the dynamics play out between the drivers and teams this year. Send me a message with your predictions to Mission Makers or dj.n1nja on Instagram. We've also got some amazing guests coming on the show this season, so be sure to subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Thank you again for listening, and if you're interested in supporting the show and getting some really cool rewards like DJ lessons and life coaching, don't forget to visit www.patreon.com/Mission Makers.